Now, often before that's happened, but when things are getting a bit fluffy, if you like, a new manager or a new chief executive may come in, see what's happened, and say, this is absolutely unacceptable. Our costs have gone through the roof, our competitors are jumping all around us, or in the public sector, the cost of the services we're providing are untenable. Something has to be done. And unsurprisingly, he or she will try to not produce, that's the wrong word, try to put in place yet another tripod, which we talk about as the rigid tripod. And because by this stage there'll be, as I've said, high anxiety about costs, often about morale. And this is one of the really difficult things. When people set out to empower and they move towards that diffuse pattern, they often get involved in employee engagement surveys of various kinds. And quite often initially the employee engagement surveys are quite positive, but as things get looser and looser, so instead of what organizations would look for, which is increased scores about employee engagement, they get decreasing scores. So your costs have risen, your morale has fallen, your competitors are all over the place. And a new senior manager comes in and says, right, this is going to be sorted. And he or she would be aware, they wouldn't obviously use the language I'm using, but they would be aware that they can't go back to the instructing of the tripod for continuity. They may know, not necessarily again in our language, but they will have a sense of the need to describe intent, to be clear about boundaries. But they will be faced with such a diffused, anxiety-ridden organization that what they will tend to do is to enforce. And they will say, right, from now on, this is going to happen at 2:10 every Wednesday. That's an extreme version of it, but it is often their reaction to this diffused state and their recognition that, as I've said, they can't go back, but they don't necessarily know how to make the journey towards what we would see as the optimal position. So they enforce. The almost immediate consequence of that is that people who, up until now, initially, when the diffuse tripod started, would have at first felt trusted, then they would have begun to feel mistrustful, as I was saying, actually end up, the pattern, the relationship between the managers and the people ends up as a matter of distrust, because often these are new managers now who have come in to sort things out. And they just think, well, this lot who've been here up until now, clearly you can't trust them an inch, because they're all over the place, they're not containing costs, they're not managing waste, maybe they're not treating customers as they're meant to, all those things. So rather than even considering trusting their judgment, the general attitude that builds up is one of mutual distrust, which is not helpful. And particularly not helpful when the managers are trying to draw everything together. So the consequence of that enforcing and distrust is obviously that people become thoroughly frustrated. If they've stayed with it, they've been through a journey. They were there initially in a setting where they were respected and used and valued for their skills. Then there's been this attempt to empower them, and they've had 2 or 3 opportunities perhaps to use their judgment and feel fine. Now they're back to, this is how it will be done, this is when it will be done, and that's it. Particularly, actually, if I think about it, the message, this is how it will be done. It's that bites most deeply into people's longing to use their judgment. People will, in my experience, will tolerate quite well-defined, explicit boundaries around budgets, around timing, around quality. but anything that goes into, and this is how you will do it, goes into what people regard as their space, their space for using their own discretion. So people will have been through the journey. In the tripod for continuity, they will have been subject to and accept administration, being administered. Then they will have moved to this stage where they feel neglected and unheard. Now they find themselves faced by what I chose to describe as policing, which is, where were you when this meeting started? Why were you 2 minutes late? I need to see your expenses every 3 days. Those which can feel quite extraordinarily tight, to put it mildly, and again, obviously, totally lacking in any kind of trust or any sense of that. And quite often when I talk about the rigid tripod and the diffuse tripod, one of the things people often describe, and I haven't actually, although I think about it, I haven't drawn this one, if you like, or put this one together. People say that sometimes they find themselves in an organization where there is enforcing, in other words, that very, very tight rigidity, and neglect. So in other words, they're experiencing both the rigid and the diffuse tripod at the same time. And in some ways, people would say that, okay, if you have enforcing and policing together, you sort of know where you are. You don't like it, and you feel constrained and often frightened, but at least they sort of fit together. But when you're in an environment where there is enforcing and apparent neglect, that seems to be the most disorienting, if that's, and disturbing and confusing. And it's been sort of quite sad in a way how often people will come back and say, those are the conditions in which I'm expected to work. And then if you describe to them the optimal tripod, they can see how enforcing can be mediated into tasking by being more open, by explaining intent and all those things. And that you don't have to have, it's not an alternative between policing and neglect, because the optimal position is the position of tending. If you go back to what there would have been in the tripod for continuity, there would have been loyal dependency. In the diffuse tripod, there would have been what I was talking about, the notion of anomie, no sense of boundaries. And in the optimal tripod, there would be coherence. But in the rigid tripod, by the time you've got that sense of distrust and general ill-at-easeness, you have broadly a sense of alienation. It's not simply that people don't know about or don't share a coherent view of direction in the way they might in the diffuse tripod, but they actually feel alienated from whatever they're being asked to do. And quite often it wouldn't have been adequately explained anyway. But it's just that sense of being, and again, the word alienation means that sense of feeling a stranger in the place where you are. And then if you think about the question of what would, in the optimal tripod, would be review, that awareness of tiny differences, that that intention and aspiration always to learn, to review in order to remedy. In the rigid tripod, because everything is so tight, the record keeping that belongs to the tripod for continuity becomes, or can become, so excessive that the outcome in the rigid tripod is a sense of complete paralysis. I don't think it's a phrase used so much now, but the consultants used to talk about analysis paralysis. And it just gets to the point where, in a way, there is so much that people try to keep tabs on, keep account of, that everything just seizes up. And so, understandably, so you get the rigidity. And if you then think of the question of that rigid tripod in its environment, it's in the way of the tripod of continuity would be fine in a relatively stable environment. The rigid tripod just narrows and narrows the options for the organisation to interact in a sensible and constructive way with its environment. So those organisation capabilities, which in the optimal tripod would be about judgment, or not about, they would be judgment, coherence, and review. In the rigid tripod, they've become frustration instead of judgment, alienation instead of coherence, and paralysis instead of review. So the whole feel is of an inward-looking, tight, unagile, if there is such a word, with limited capacity to respond to what is going on in the environment, either to respond to the risks of that or to respond in a way which would make the most of opportunities.